Computer storage is low? What kind of janky ass computer is he using?
He should be using a MacBook Pro. I don't know what the fuck he's doing.
Like, how much space is this fucking? How is this possible? Like, what the?
I'm very sure he's using a MacBook Pro, which means I do not know what he loaded his
What the
computer
fuck is
with.
like? How much porn do you?
Exactly. It's like, Jangan, you gotta quit the porn, buddy. All right. Hello, barbarians, and welcome to the 11th episode of the LLB podcast, Low Level Barbarians, from Asia on Asia, with discussion and debate on trending topics. With us, myself, Alex, typically your host of EOA, man of the high ground, Dave Chang. Morning,
Hey
Dave.
guys, morning.
Looking younger for some reason. With a nice, fresh white shirt. And we have Jangan, the information superconnector. How are you, sir?
I'm relegated to the smallest meeting room in the office because people saying that I'm making too much noise when I'm recording this.
Oh, really? But
Yeah.
you mostly you sit quiet and you don't talk that loud, do you? Okay, according to them. And today we're missing, sadly, the master of technical difficulties, Andrew G. He missed his. He has a delayed flight, so he won't be joining us. Sadly, we could have used his insights, but nonetheless, I think we'll still have a good discussion. So, first topic, I think this is the elephant in the room. We can't avoid this: the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, Dave and I were briefly chatting about this yesterday. It's hard. It's hard to come up with something to talk about this, right? Because a lot of the angles have been discussed already on the media circuits, on podcasts. So I don't know. For me, though, I guess when I started looking at the Ukraine invasion and how to think about it, was trying to understand like nature of war, of what we've been seeing in the past few decades, right? So because I think in the back of my mind, I know that America's been at war for the past 30 years in the Middle East. So I was just trying to compare and contextualize. So I don't know. Do you guys know how many troops have been sent to the Middle East between Iraq and Afghanistan since 2001? Can you guess?
You mean deployed?
20,000?
Deployed.
No, more than that. It should be 200 to 300. Wait, Iraq and Afghanistan?
For 2 decades, right? From 2001 till 2021, about, because we pulled out already from both countries, 2020 then 2021.
It's gotta be like at least 500,000.
1.9 to 3 million people were deployed
Yeah, that makes
across
sense.
2 decades, right?
So
So that's
Alex,
and this is from
if a person is sent there twice, does it count as 2 times or just 1 time?
yeah. So they were counting. I think they also counted people who served more than once, but it was like average of 2 or 3.
Yep.
I forget what the actual number was.
That's how live streaming websites count viewers. But anyway, so.
Well, still, I mean, we're talking in the millions, right? I mean, if everyone was sent one time, right, we're talking 150 to 100 to 150,000 people sent every year. So, and then how many people do you think have died as direct conflict from the war? Do you think?
You included civilian casualties.
No, not civilian.
Just U.S. military personnel.
No, I think just direct casualties from both sides. I think it's like estimated. This is from the Watson Institute of Brown University, by the way. So you could fact check it.
It's got to be hundreds of thousands as well.
Yeah, it's about 246,000. Then if you include civilians, it's like a few more 100,000 apparently. So, right. So if you put that to context of scale, I think I didn't dig into the other wars. Ukraine's been fighting Russia in the Donbass region for 8 years. I think in the past few decades, Russia invaded a few other countries, right? So it's like the war is nothing new, but I would argue for the majority of the world, war is just so far in the back of our mind. Like we don't think or feel it every day. But if you look at the context, what the Americans have been doing, invading, versus what Russia's doing, it's about the same scale. I think at the border, when there was escalating, there was about 150,000 troops on the border of Ukraine going in, right? So like that just begged the question to me is like, why do people care all of a sudden about war? And what do you guys think that's the case? Like the war is nothing new apparently, but why now is the media? Or am I wrong? Maybe it's the same reaction we had before. Go ahead.
I think a few things, right? So when America launches the invasion, it just, I mean, it's always in a sort of far-flung place that's distant from what we are exposed to on a daily basis. And I think even the war in Yemen, I mean, there was those one or two attacks in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, but it is still quite distant. But this, for a lot of people, and especially I'm presuming that you guys have lots of European friends, and this is very close to home for many of them.
Western Europe,
So
right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, even the people in Eastern Europe, they get scared because suddenly they realize that okay, the world order they have been living in, I mean, is shattered. So you can't have this kind of invasion happening in the heart of Europe now, which is unimaginable for lots of people. I mean, I would presume for people who of a different generation who have been through wars, maybe in the early 1990s in the Balkans, etc. So
Yeah,
maybe this comes as something which is not
true.
really that of a shock because you know how war feels like, but for many people this is unimaginable.
For the younger generation, especially, right?
And and one thing I've been so I was discussing with the friends before the invasion started, and my thought was actually I didn't think that Putin would invade Ukraine, to be honest. So
Yeah.
I based on my sort of assessment on two things. First, I mean, if you talk to people in Russia, there didn't seem to be any sort of propaganda war saying that, hey, this guy Zelensky, he's a demon. We must, you know, you know, we're trying to launch away. Even the US, before they went to Iraq, they have to sort of launch the
Propaganda
propaganda
machine.
machine. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
we didn't see that happening in Russia. So and also another thing which I use as a proxy is that I mean Putin had a chat with Xi right at the Winter Olympics, and I presume that if he really wanted to do something, he would probably have indicated something to Xi, but before the invasion, you didn't see any sign from the embassy of China in Kiev saying that hey, we must evacuate. Bear in mind that that they issued evacuation notice in Afghanistan a few months before the U.S. withdrawal. So, so that was my assessment, and but apparently I was wrong. So I'm trying to figure out whether the invasion was planned or it was because I mean he was previously bluffing, but because of circumstances and things went out of control, and he suddenly pulled the trigger. Because if you look at many of the operations of Russian troops on the ground, it doesn't seem to be that well coordinated. It doesn't seem to be something which is very well planned.
Well, can I ask you, how are you basing your assessment off that? Because the media, from depending on which media source you're looking at, you're going to hear varying different things from propaganda to psyops to one narrative to the other narrative. So how do you know it's not as effective as you say? Because they seem to have covered ground very fast, right?
I think I mean come on it's 2020s. I mean I'm not saying that who is right who is wrong, but if you're launching a war against the enemy, you probably don't want their leader to be right in the center of the city
True.
which you are supposed to surround and still tweet.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.
I think the first
Well,
place, yeah. So they didn't jam the communication networks. I
I
don't
see
know
what you
why.
mean. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's my
Okay, that's
assessment.
fair.
So anyway, so it's very I mean it's very hard to predict what will happen because by the time I mean by the time we release this episode, it's a few days after we have talked right now,
Yeah.
and
It may
things might have
change.
evolved very differently, and on the ground things are very hard to predict. Things could change, and
Yeah.
one miscalculation could lead to very different results. But what I do
Yeah.
think is that it's quite difficult for them to reach a negotiated outcome because obviously Putin, I mean, having dedicated so much resources into this
Yeah.
conflict, I mean, he will probably not want to go back empty-handed because that will undermine his legitimacy in Russia.
Yeah, I think everyone's showing face too, right? So even Zelensky has to, even I think he even admitted it, that he's saying that he's open to talking, but he knows it's not going to lead anywhere. But you still have to show face to the world that you're trying to resolve it by other means, right?
Yep.
Dave, how do you feel about this?
There's a lot to talk about. So, sorry, I just let's get straight to it. I don't know. So I had the same thought as you, Alex. I'm just trying to evaluate over the weekend, over the last couple of days, like what is different about this particular war, especially vis-a-vis the context of the 2008 war, where Russia invaded Georgia, right? So that's actually a lot of similarities between the two scenarios. So for those of you who don't remember it, in '08, Russia invaded Georgia also right during the Olympics. It was during the 2000s. It was like literally in
Wow.
the middle of the '08 Beijing Olympics.
Holding up tradition, I guess.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
goodness.
like a tradition. It's Russian tradition. Let's invade a country during the
Yeah.
Olympics.
Remind everyone every 4 years.
Yeah, exactly. And but there's a lot of similarities, right? So Georgia was also obviously a former Soviet state, source for former Soviet territory, and the pretext for it was actually very similar. So in '08, I believe that was the year that NATO actually passed a resolution to offer both Ukraine and Georgia membership into NATO, right? And Putin said essentially the same thing that he's saying now, is that this is like a red line for me, and I, this is a no go. And very also very similar. So there in Georgia at the time, there were these two sort of like breakaway separatist regions. I'm going to really butcher the pronunciation of them. One of them was called like South Ossetia, and then Abkhazia, right? So it's very similar to what's
Well, we
happening
can't
now.
verify that for you, but yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no.
yeah, you guys can't verify that with me, right? But so I apologize to whoever is listening. You're from those regions. I'm sorry, I butchered the pronunciation. And I think this like if you look at that and compare these two scenarios, it's very telling. Or there's a lot of sort of conclusions you can draw. So that war lasted for 12 days. So Russia came in, they invaded for 12 days. They basically took control of the capital, and then at the end of the 12-day conflict, they basically recognized those two breakaway regions as separate autonomous territories,
Yeah.
and they left. And so one of the reasons why I think we're talking about like why the Russian military doesn't seem to be performing as well is I think they did not expect um, this level of resistance. I think they were thinking it'd be a quick, easy win, right? So again,
Yeah.
I was listening to reports about this. So essentially, it sounds like they're not using combined arms strategy, and it's sort of like a very piecemeal operation, and they haven't really brought into sort of like play their most effective tools. So there's talks of them now evaluating sort of like cluster munitions, artillery, and just being sort of like ramping up the
Yeah.
escalation, the amount of force that they're willing to use. So that's
Hmm.
one thing.
Hmm.
Um, so back to the question. I think that's really the more interesting question. Is like what is different about this time, and what is different than say 2008, right? So I agree with Junggan.
Yeah.
Number one, yeah, Georgia is some far flung country that's right over by
It's
like
a small country.
yeah, and also it's in that region. It's by Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan. I mean, if we're being a little bit blunt,
I
like
mean,
the
if,
part.
if you just think about the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, it didn't receive as much attention as what's happening now, right? I mean, it was
Exactly.
last year, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's in this far flung corner of the world that honestly Western media does not really care about that much, right? It's obviously much smaller, right? Ukraine is like I think the second largest country by landmass
Well,
in Europe.
well, yeah, I think Jankan's point also stands that for Western Europe, given the size of Ukraine, it's like 44 million people versus Georgia, which is like 3 million people. It's a bit more existential for Western European people than. But the question is, why does American media care about it so much?
So
Is it
this,
just
yeah,
an excuse for another news cycle?
yeah. So this is actually yeah. So this is what I'm into. I think this is the most pertinent question, and I think for me the main difference that I can think about between 2008 and 2022 in the context of America is the narrative that America is a declining empire was not nearly as
That's
prevalent
true.
then
Yeah.
as it is now. And also, this is mirrored also both internally and externally. Externally, we all live abroad, and as Americans, we can see. But internally, like I think Americans also feel like this is sort of the beginning of the end, and we're sort of sliding. Right? If you look at sort of these polls that are being done in the U.S. sentiment right now about like whether the country's on the right track, whether it's doing well, it's like they're at historical
Yeah.
lows. Like the latest one is saying that like basically, I mean, it depends on which poll you look at, but basically anywhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of the American population is basically is under the pretense or the idea that we're definitely heading in the wrong direction and the sort of our best days are behind us, right? So it's like record level
Yeah.
pessimism. And then also you have to sort of like think about this, like this is like right on the back. This is like months after the US just withdrew from
Yeah.
Afghanistan,
Correct.
which for the most part, public opinion in America seems to think that was like very, very poorly done,
It
right?
was a disaster.
It was, yeah.
Like you could look at the results. I mean, I was digging into this yesterday, and well, the most interesting was Iraq was like the official 2020 was like like when they pulled out all the troops, I think, and surprisingly, Iraq has a fledgling democracy still. There's still ISIS attacks in the north, but they've like done their first parliamentary election, which is very interesting. But Afghanistan's a complete opposite mess where the Taliban has full control. They just reversed everything. They just separated women from men in universities. No more media allowed, right? So very disastrous effects. So yeah, I don't know. That's just maybe a little tidbit there.
Another question which I really want to find out about this conflict or is the consequences, right? So of course, I mean, none of us likes war. None of us wants this to happen,
Yeah.
and it has happened. We all wanted to end. I mean,
Yes.
quickly, ideally through peaceful means. And of course, I mean, all this ammunition that's been sent to Ukraine, that does it actually help it end quickly, or does it aggravate the situation? We don't know, because I mean, this is a battlefield. I mean, information is chaos,
Yeah.
so we don't know. But I think we should probably think about some of the long-term consequences. I mean, like almost is it for the first time? But at least it's the first time I'm hearing it. Like, banks from major countries being excluded from SWIFT. So
Yeah.
that's something that I think people around me are saying that, okay, it's very hard for the West to put it together, but it has happened. So that will probably accelerate China's deployment of its own settlement system. I mean, it's already there. Not many people is using it. Not many people are using it,
Yeah.
but they're probably going to
Oh.
accelerate that. I mean, feeling a sense of insecurity. And the second is something that I'm still trying to understand. I don't have answer yet. Is that how that impact the tech companies in other parts of the world, in Southeast Asia, because this obviously would impact, I mean, how the money is flowing, and short term, medium term, maybe long term, but we don't know. I mean, for instance, I mean, here you have quite a bit of companies which are funded by Russian capital.
That's
Oh, interesting.
that's actually true. That's
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's true. A lot of times, especially early 2011, I met quite a lot of Russian investors who were looking to invest. And that was very early days.
That was early days.
So
I
very
remember.
early days,
I
right?
remember those guys.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the same thing actually, John Gon. And so I think my immediate conclusions, sort of like I can take away now, is so obviously in the U.S. they've been having some long or sort of these like we've been having supply chain issues for a long time now, ever since COVID started, right? For the last like 18 to 24 months. And I think what's happening now is going to only exaggerate those problems, right? So in terms of what I mean by that, so it's twofold. On one hand, right, I think the dominant concern economically in the US right now is what's happening with inflation and what's happening with the US economy. And inflation is driven by two things. Inflation is driven by one, the amount of liquidity, amount of capital in the market, and it's also driven by supply chains, right? So this will only have negative effect for inflation, right? So, oil prices are already going up. I didn't know this, but actually, Russia accounts for 7% of the natural gas that the U.S. Uses because they banned
Imports.
fracking.
Yeah,
Or yeah, imports. They actually
yeah,
banned fracking a couple years ago, right? Also, obviously, Ukraine and Russia together, they're actually pretty big agricultural producers.
bread
They
baskets.
produce
Yeah,
19% of global corn. Ukraine specifically is a pretty big source of copper and platinum and other materials that are used for microprocessors and batteries. So there's definitely going to be like impacts in terms of inflation, right? And so then the question becomes, okay, so we're going to have further inflation in the U.S. Therefore, what is the Federal Reserve going to do? So I think the common narrative that we were talking about the last couple of months is that the Fed has been raising interest rates to combat inflation, right? But then it's also not common for a central bank to raise interest rates during a conflict, right? So I think,
Yeah.
but overall, I think this is going to have further exaggerating effects in terms of overall liquidity in the market. You already see it in the market, right? This is definitely having an impact on the equities market. And as we say, the private markets follow the public market. So anything that happens in the public markets will eventually ripple down into the private markets. It
Eventually.
might take 2 to 3 months or sometimes longer
Maybe longer.
to
Yeah.
to do it, right? But I think fundamentally this will it doesn't change, I think, our original analysis of what companies or how companies should behave in sense of like at some point liquidity will dry up and people should start raising capital now if they still can and sort of settle in for potentially like a winter season coming up.
Well, doesn't that also depend the nature of U.S. involvement, or you're saying that the macroeconomic effects will ripple no matter what? And like,
It doesn't matter.
I mean,
It's still
because
interrelated right now. Like it'll
yeah,
ripple through no matter what.
yeah. But this what tied to what U.S. consumption is suppressed because like, I mean, if the U.S. is not involved directly, why does raising rates how does that what's the interconnection then between raising rates and it being disastrous then with the
Well,
ripple effects from the war?
Well, think about it, right? Like basically the price, like if you're in the US right now, like everything's going to go up in price, right? Your gas is going to go up in
Yeah,
price, your heating
yeah,
bills are going
gas,
to go up in
yes, yeah,
price, your food bills probably
yeah,
go up in price, right? And
yeah,
then like the supply chain issues, right? So let's back up even more. Like, you know, energy is an input. It's like one of the largest input costs in the manufacturing production of everything, right? Everything that's created,
yeah.
you need oil and gas,
That's
right?
true.
And so Russia is a huge producer and exporter. They're a huge net exporter of oil and gas. So basically, the costs and price of everything are going to go up even more in the U.S., right? We're talking like
Yeah,
7% inflation last time. Now, who knows what's going to be? It could be 8, it could be 10%, right?
yeah,
So when those prices go up, sentiment goes down, right? Consumer sentiment goes down. That will have an impact on global earnings or the company's earnings, right? And then that's what I'm saying. Those public market
yeah,
ripple effects will eventually go through into the private markets. It's just a question of like when.
yeah. So then I guess if you tie it back to what Jangan's saying, like how do we get squeezed down to Southeast Asia? Valuations compress more. It's harder to raise money. More sensible valuations, I'm guessing.
I, I think these are possible scenarios, but it is war, right? You don't know how it would end. You don't
Yeah,
even
it's
know
true.
what will happen
Yep.
tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So, so one thing that I've been discussing with a few friends is what's the consequence on China, right? I mean, on the one hand, um, there's this hypothesis that China's biggest fear is the U.S. trying to pull Russia towards its own orbit. Then, if that happens, China will be completely surrounded.
Well, but from a
And
media perspective, that's what's happening, right? Like you see the
that,
protests in Moscow and this kind of stuff, right? The
so
world
so
reaction.
so basically, the current scenario is playing to the favor of Xi from a geopolitical point of view because Putin is obviously alienated by the West, and
Yeah,
but the question is that if this war draws on, if it causes instability of the regime in Russia, nobody knows what will happen. So I
that's
would say
true.
that I mean we can predict a few scenarios, and if those scenarios do happen, what are the consequences? But exactly what kind of scenario will happen, um, it's probably
Yeah,
going to be
yeah. I
fluid
see
for a
your point.
while. Mm.
So then, I think lots of times ideology is used as an excuse to maintain power, but in this case, it really sounds like it's a true means to defend a way of life because it's more existential, like you said, for Western Europe. For Russia, it's very clear, like if you are Putin himself, you could see the ration from his side, like my way of life and my power and all my success I derive from needs to be defended. And if that affects also
Mm.
China, China has a dog in the game to make sure Putin doesn't fall either. So in a sense, like if we're going by ideology and a way of life, it just seems like this would have to escalate on a much bigger scale if everyone's putting all their cards in, right? Like everyone wants to maintain their status quo, but if the balance changes one or the other, it's really existential and life threatening for those either side's way of life, right? So
And
I think ideology actually does really matter here. We tend to dismiss it, or we when we're young kids learning about history and the reasons for stopping the spread of communism from an American history perspective, we kind of think that's ridiculous because so many people died, and we say it's a mistake. But does ideology matter? Do you guys think here?
I think ideology matters less than geopolitics.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's an excuse then? So
Yeah,
then,
I mean, she is I mean, more of a more of a Chinese dictator rather than a communist dictator. Put it that way.
yeah. But I mean, like it does matter if you had to say if you were Ukrainian. Like, come on, you're going to tell me the ideology doesn't matter? Your whole life is changing. You're living under a different regime now, or like if someone invades your country, right? So doesn't it matter?
I think it still matters geopolitics. I mean, if you look at, I mean, if you look at both Russia and Ukraine in the 1990s after the Soviet Union, I mean, both wanted to join the Western order, and Boris
Mm,
Yeltsin wants to be accepted by the West, and I think what's the guy's name? Leonid Kuchma, the Ukrainian leader,
yeah, yeah,
wanted to join the Western order as well. And obviously, for smaller countries, much easier to be accepted. But for a big country as
yeah.
Russia, I mean, when when it carries its weight into the Western orbit, and it will not be accepted. I mean, same for the same reason that the European Union doesn't want to accept Turkey.
I think consequentially that's true, right? Like you cannot, if that's how the powers over your lives be, and you're under that system, then you're stuck. But you could ask yourself this question: like, would you rather live under Russia, China, or America? Or some other country, right? And then like we have the privilege to kind of choose at this point in time because we're in the other
Yep.
sphere, but other
Yep.
people really don't. So I don't know.
Yep. So complicated.
Yeah, I don't know. Final question of this: who do you think are the winners and losers of this? I mean, or roughly speaking, like I know you said we can't really predict anything; it's too unpredictable. But what are potential people benefiting? Because one narrative I hear that China does benefit from this because the decline of two great powers, right? And they just need to sit and wait for them to dog it out.
Yeah.
The other, I don't know. What do you guys think? Who wins and who loses here?
Well, I mean, I think since we're talking about China, I think this is like actually a really interesting case study, for lack of better words, for China. And like, I think this, like, how the West reacts right now to an invasion of a country by like a foreign aggressor, whatever, is
Correct.
actually a
Yeah.
good
True.
learning experiences. And they can look at this as a template for how they want to deal with Taiwan going forward,
Correct.
right? So I mean, I agree. I think one of the big problems here is that the Russians did almost no PR when it came before they invaded, and so like one of the
Yeah.
big learning points here is that you need to at least have some trumped up justification. Otherwise, like the
Correct.
West will universally
Yeah.
condemn you, and China very much
Well,
cares about that, right?
so was
But
was Putin trolling us then when he said he wants to denazify, or was he actually trying to like seriously thought it would help appeal to the West, or what?
no, I mean, I think he's pretty. The guy's pretty savvy, right? I think he's just
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's a trumped up bullshit
So he was
excuse.
serious then. So that means he does feel that an organized Nazi militia in Ukraine does threaten Russia.
No,
He
no, no,
does
no.
actually
I
feel that.
think I think he was. I think that's just trumped up BS.
Oh, okay,
Right.
okay, okay.
It's like
Yeah,
it's like the same. It's the same thing. We talked about this, right? There's some like Russian minister, like I think the foreign minister, basically said that we're invading Ukraine to deal with their weapons of mass destruction, which is like a direct jab at the
yeah,
U.S.
yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. Yeah, correct.
that's a straight up jab.
That's
Um,
true. Yeah,
I think actually the biggest loser of this is probably going to be Russia. I don't really see them coming out of
mm,
this
interesting.
with a lot of I don't see this. There's not many scenarios where I think they would come out of this positively, right? Like either they back
Unless
down
they,
in Ukraine
correct.
and
Yeah,
they lose face, right? Putin will definitely lose face and prestige, uh, or if they become more aggressive and start to deploy more aggressive tactics, the condemnations are going to increase and the sanctions that are being imposed on them already are going to increase as well. So actually, let me rephrase that. I think the losers here are definitely going to be the Russian people. No matter what
mm,
happens, this
yeah,
is bad for
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the Russian people, right? I mean,
That's
already
true.
it's terrible. Like the ruble dropped like 25% yesterday in
Yeah,
one day alone, right? And there's like,
there's bank
I
runs happening, and
yeah, I have friends that live in Russia. There's stories of people going and like panic buying like Gucci bags and stuff as a store of value. No, we laugh about it,
Oh
but
my
I'm
god.
serious. It's not a joke. It's
Well, yeah, actually, no, you're right. Like,
yeah,
it's yeah, that's kind of scary. That's really
yeah,
scary.
yeah. So I mean, the loser in this definitely Russian people. Like,
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt about that.
Jangan, who do you think? Winners, losers, possibilities?
I I think Singapore is probably going to be a winner, although they will never admit that. So whenever something happens, I mean, capital fly to Singapore, and
That's true. That's quite true, though.
and also I think it's also I think Prime Minister of Singapore said was that yesterday or the day before yesterday, and what happened in Ukraine shows the importance to have your own defense for a small country. So this is something that the government had invested in a lot since the since the beginning of the republic.
Yeah.
And you probably know that. I mean, you probably don't know that, but I think when I first came to Singapore, I read something about the geography, and at that time that was 2001. So 26 of the land in Singapore is owned by the Ministry of Defense. So they took defense very, very
Wow.
seriously. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, they learned from World War II, right? The Japanese rolled up in bicycles and took over. Guns were pointed the wrong way.
Yeah, yeah, and also all the confrontation that was happening when Singapore gained independence. Um, I, I think it's a reminder that the government can come out and tell its people that okay, we do all these things that you now resent because your kids have to go to the army, but we do
Yeah.
that for a reason. I think another thing which the government was probably I'm not sure whether they're going to do that, but another important fact that I think Singapore did right is racial harmony, right? I mean, so it's Chinese majority, but they retain English as the official language, and they ensure that
Tamil as well.
yeah,
Malay.
yeah,
Those are all four national languages.
no, four official languages and one national language, which is Malay.
Well, but they also did stamp out all of the dialects, which you could argue, same as Indonesia, you need to unify the country, I guess.
Yep,
Like the
yep, yeah.
Chinese Cultural Revolution. So
Be- because if you look at what happened in Ukraine, and I think the native Russian speakers are not happy at all the actions by the central government in Kiev to try
yeah,
to oppress the Russian language, and it's a fact that there's a significant Russian speaking population there, and you can't deny that fact. And if you keep sort of stoking up the nationalist sentiment about the sort of Ukrainian identity, some people are going to be left unhappy, and you can't drive these people away.
yeah.
So whether Russia invades or not, you are going to have this tension in your country for the long term if you pursue this policy.
that's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Let's jump to the next topic. It's too bad our friend Master G is not here. Alibaba talked about spinning off Lazada, right? So they were about to raise $1 billion for a Lazada IPO, but it seems they had to pause it because they weren't getting the valuation they're looking for. So it seems that they have to go back to the drawing board, double down, and they want to quintuple their GMV to 100 billion. So I don't know. What do you guys think this signals? From a perspective from Alibaba, do they have the balance sheet to support this? Are they going to try to compete without raising the money? Why were they trying to do this in the first place? Is it their trouble? They can't seem to figure out Southeast Asia, or what do you guys see from your perspective? And also to note, this was like after Alibaba missed revenue estimates for 2 straight quarters too. So there's a lot of interesting headwinds for Alibaba, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. So yeah, it is. I agree with you. It's a shame that Andrew isn't here because he's one with the most insight. But I mean, if you think about it, right? There's typically like some fairly well established reasons for why a company would spin off a subsidiary or a division, right? And so
Yeah.
let's just go through them, right? So there's like number one,
Okay.
uh, it's a management issue, right? The parent company realizes that they might be better suited to oversee some of their lines of business, but then maybe there's this one business that doesn't quite match their expertise,
Yeah.
right? So then they spin
Yeah.
it off. So then the top management can better focus on their core business, and they can bring in like a new, more suitable management team for
Yeah.
the subsidiary, whatever gets spun off, right? So that's one
Yeah.
reason. Another reason is the main business and the subsidiary business are on different growth trajectories, right? And maybe
Mm.
a subsidization that's being. I mean, we know that there's subsidization happening from
Yeah, of
one
course.
business to another. Everyone knows this,
Yeah.
right? Uh, but yeah, maybe like overall, like the strategies of the core business and then the subsidiary business are now diverging, and they'd be better suited for them to go their separate ways, right? Another reason, which I don't think is like relevant in this case, is typically when the subsidiary gets spun off, you get better coverage or more accurate coverage from the securities analysts because there's less things to dig through and it's more transparent, right?
Mm,
But I don't think
yeah.
that that's the case here. And
Yeah. I
then
don't
the
think that's
fine,
yeah.
yeah, I don't think that they don't. I don't think Alibaba cares. And then the final reason, and I think this is probably the most reasonable one, is it they think it makes sense financially, like it unlocks shareholder value, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
there's a lot of research that's done and a lot of case studies that basically whenever a company gets spun off, eventually like within like 18 to 24 months, the two entities are like combined
Both.
24%.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're both doing better from a capitalization point of view than the original business, right? So I think they just thought this was an opportunity to capture some shareholder value, is my guess, right? I think if you were to ask me, the two most likely reasons is one, they think that they don't want to subsidize this anymore, and two, they can probably make some capital gains doing this.
Hmm. Before I comment, Jangan, what do you think?
I think I agree with the potential risks that they mentioned, and also I think from additional point I would like to raise is that I mean from organization point of view, I think there's lots of value that Lazada needs to unlock. So I know lots of people in Lazada, and especially the batch of I think the Chinese operatives that they sent in 2018. Lots of them very strong
Hmm. Yeah.
individually, and
Some of the best from China, right?
they took some of the best from Taobao and Tmall to basically help Lazada. So the reason why I think Lazada is in a situation today, which is I mean overtaken by Shopee. Of course, long term is still hard to say, right?
Yeah.
It's largely organizational. So we have so many people who are individually strong, and are you able to sort of have a structure to get them to work all towards one direction? Because I mean, if you look at least from outside, what you see the strategy of Lazada sort of swings, and sometimes it's
Mm,
focusing on brands doing the right thing,
yeah.
and sometimes it's trying to basically catch up with Shopee doing free shipping and stuff. So so whenever you have this swing, so sort of people's attention is actually wasted, and I think same thing happened with Ant Group's initiative in Southeast Asia as well. So so if you spin it off and make it clear that who is actually leading it, and make other shareholders to come and hold the leadership accountable, it's probably a good thing.
I'm trying to think out loud here. And does that mean this kind of fits into this narrative of Chinese expansion struggling beyond their own borders? Because that was a very big narrative over the past 10 years. I mean, I think Tencent struggled for a long time, though I think their main product now, Jukes, apparently has a lot of market share. I don't know how true that is. And I mean, given the nature of how price elastic a lot of Southeast Asia is, the model tends to work. But in general, I don't know any other big, successful, massive exports from China in the Southeast Asia region. So do you think this is fit in this narrative where just the Chinese management couldn't figure it out? It's just that their method doesn't export well, or this
I
is not
think
really the case?
I sorry, Dave, you want to go first?
No, you go first, Shankar. You go. Well, yeah,
Uh,
no, you go
uh,
first. You go first. Yeah.
yeah, because I just wrote a book about it, and
Oh
it's
yeah, then you go.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
right. You did
yeah,
write a
it's
book. You
yeah.
didn't tell us about your book.
Yeah, tell us about your.
yeah
Can we
yeah.
do like
I
a book
mean,
review next time?
We should do a book review. Yeah, we'll
Can
do
we
a
do a
book
book
review
review?
next time.
yes, and I need to deliver like additional I think 20,000 words to the publisher by mid of this month because they said you write too
This
much
was the
like an
bane of your
investor.
existence.
You write too much like an investor, very concise, and but we
They need
want more
more.
stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
More fluff.
But anyway,
Okay.
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 so the book is about Chinese companies outside China, and we look at I mean the tech giants, the startups, and basically the other companies in the tech sector which are expanding outside China, and 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 to be honest, up until now we see more problems than successes. The problems are usually about leadership, about organization, about people. less so about the product, because I think product's more downstream, and these guys typically have very good tech and product capabilities and good experience. Um, the challenge is that when you have a large home market which consumes most of the leaders' attention and mental space, and how do you allocate resources adequately to a subsidiary in a foreign market where you don't have the full information, or you have full information, you don't know how to make a judgment because you are not physically there.
Yeah.
So I do think that's not uniquely a problem with Chinese companies. I think that's a problem with many large
All
companies
companies.
with large home market trying to expand. I mean, if you look at the early days, some of the Japanese internet companies trying to expand in Southeast Asia didn't really succeed, and Gojek tries to
Yeah.
expand out of Indonesia, doesn't really get anywhere.
Yeah.
So
Correct.
so I think this problem is something to do with the leadership, so something to do with the organization, something to do with how resources are allocated, and also what kind of people you use, right? I mean, if a Chinese company decides to, so for instance, Lazada, I mean, how Alibaba convinced those people to come to Lazada is by, it's not by saying that, hey, you are going to own the price of Malaysia. Nobody cares about Malaysia from China. It's too small a market. A category Tmall is larger than the whole market of Malaysia. So what they care about is that, hey, Alibaba is going to double its size by serving 2 billion people. Now we have like, I don't know, 700 million, 800 million in China.
Yeah.
And we can serve 2 billion people. We need to crack international markets. And you guys are the commandos. And once you figure this out, and once our international markets grow, you guys are at the forefront. I mean, this is what brought those people in the first space.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well, which is interesting. When I was reading the article, the Bloomberg article you sent, right? I was quite surprised to hear Daraz was also still around, which was the other rocket venture that Alibaba bought, right? So it was, and then they were saying that
Oh,
from growth from cloud, growth from external businesses like Lazada, Daraz. There was one more company from Turkey
Trendio.
that yeah, sure, yeah, that's going to be the main engines of growth going forward. So it does seem that they have to figure out the international expansion piece, which again is tied to what you're talking about. And I guess if anyone's very interested about this topics, I would recommend reading Frank Sleuth's book, The CEO of Snowflake. So essentially, that's what he had to do when he joined Snowflake. It was already quite successful, but he somehow managed to grow to a $200 billion monster. And I think there's a lot of lessons along those themes that might be interesting to check out as well.
yeah.
Go get our book is out in July. So,
Oh, that's when your book is dropping, Jianggan? Okay.
yeah.
No, I think you're
Newsletter in
right
July.
though. Yeah. I mean I also had some first-hand experience with this, working as like the leader of a subsidiary division of a company whose parent was American, right? I think it's a question of like incentives and organizational incentives, right? So like one of the common things that I always had, one of the conflicts I always had with the US when I was working Living Social is because we were working off like a centralized tech platform, right? So the feature set and a lot of the things that you created from like a product and tech point of view were very much optimized for the American market,
The
and
American
we
market,
always
yeah,
had to find some way to either
hack it,
literally jury rig
yeah,
it. We literally had to jury rig this thing to make it suit our needs, and it was always an incredibly inelegant solution, right? So
yeah,
that's just a question of incentives, right? Like, as a leader of a large organization, obviously I would deploy resources where the highest ROI is. So if you have a market that's
yeah,
like
correct.
50 times the size of
That's true.
Malaysia, then why would you deploy,
Mm, yeah,
features
correct.
for the Malaysian market? And also, I think, I guess, one more question for Jianggan, right? Like in your book, in your work, like I'm starting to like sort of think that the Chinese tech companies do a really good job as investors in foreign tech companies. I'm actually looking at Tencent as a great case study of this. I think Tencent has made some like really
You
savvy
don't. I
investments
mean,
in the gaming space.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
Blizzard, Riot,
Yeah,
they're huge,
yeah,
right?
they show
Um,
up everywhere.
they show up everywhere. But yeah, like from like an operational point of view, I remember like a couple years ago when they tried to expand WeChat globally, and they spent like $200 million
Yeah,
hiring Ronaldo as a spokesperson, and it literally got them nowhere. So I guess my question is like, do you think this is like sort of like an acceptance among the Chinese tech ecosystem that maybe they're better functioning or they're better as capital allocators than they are as operators when it comes to international tech companies? Like, what do you think?
I I think that's fairly specific about Tencent because they do the same thing in China.
Hmm.
they allocate capital, they invest in people, in companies, in ecosystem. I mean,
Mm.
uh, before they dished out JD shares as dividends to Tencent shareholders last year, and Tencent was the biggest shareholder of JD,
Yeah.
and I think the biggest shareholder of Pinduoduo, and the biggest shareholder, the biggest institutional shareholder or corporate shareholder of Meituan, the biggest
Mm.
shareholder of Baker, the biggest shareholder of Futu. So, but it has WeChat, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
I think initially many companies, Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba, all had this debate. So there are many things we could do based on the customer
Mm.
traffic and data we have. And the question is that what do we do ourselves? What do we do? What do we just invest in and get other people to leverage this, who can build this better than us?
Mm.
And and of course, I mean, the companies took different routes. I mean, Baidu took the route that they wanted to do everything themselves. I mean, look
Mhm.
at where they are now.
Yeah.
And and it's, yeah, so Tencent, I think, had some serious soul searching and reflection. I think back around 2011 or 2010, can't remember exactly which year.
Mhm.
So so the conclusion is that they wanted to be an enabler. If they wanted to do everything
Mm.
themselves, I mean, it's very hard for them to execute well at every dimension, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
you will alienate themselves against the people who would otherwise be working with them.
Yeah.
So Alibaba took a
That's
different
smart.
approach. Alibaba is investing in lots of companies, but they demand lots of control over these investees. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe not intentional, but this is how the whole system sort of eventually evolved to be this way, and that is happening to Lazada. Not
Mm.
sure.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
so do you think this is very intentional part of the strategy? That's part of the long-term ecosystem building, or they've realized they have to compete in a different way outside in the Southeast Asia region or other emerging regions as well? Like, is the playbook changing, or they're still following the
I
playbook? Do
think
you think?
I think the playbook is always changing. So bear in mind they took the investment approach in India. They invest in Paytm big time, and
Yeah.
I think they invest in Snapdeal. Didn't quite work out. So
Mm.
all these episodes sort of shape the leadership's thinking about
Yeah.
and their
Sure.
assessment about the market.
Yeah.
But I think for the large, complicated foreign markets, I mean, these leaders are not in the markets themselves, so it's very hard for them to have an updated and accurate assessment.
Do you think they're? I mean, given that the fact they've been missing sales estimates and they're not growing to people's expectations, do you think this is a problem going forward, and they need to kind of, I don't know, re-strategize and I don't know, fix
I
the leaky
think
boat,
I think
or
I
this
think
it's not really a problem. They're still well capitalized and can make it happen.
I think they're still a very profitable company, put it
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
way. So, but the question here is that when a company is seemingly not going towards the right direction, when the growth is saturated, when the employees, the stock options are not really
Yeah.
growing in value, so what does that do to the morale, and what does that do
Mm.
to
Talent
the
retention.
to the best people you have? Because when things
Yeah.
are growing and people are saying, oh, I can put up with politics, I can put up with this, I can put up with like
Yeah. Correct.
analytics or
Yeah.
whatever, but when
Mm.
things are
Yeah.
not growing, so the incentives will probably be very different. I do think that's
That's
what's
true.
happening with Shopee as well nowadays, when the share price was going down. So I mean, it surely has a dent on people's morale,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it takes strong leadership to navigate through this difficult periods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to follow your thought, you said that's happening with Shopee now, right? And you said you shared an article yesterday, or you shared the link to Shopee France that they had entered the market. I had spoken to a lot of my friends who are also ex Rocket and stuff. They didn't. I mean, I think there was some buzz that they knew, but like my friend didn't even know Shopee existed in France. But apparently, they're already leaving France by March. And I mean, we're talking. He's a very savvy tech founder. He helped also build out a lot of ventures in Southeast Asia, but he moved to France. But he didn't even know Shopee was there, and he asked, "Oh, is that the Singaporean company?" He didn't really know what it was. So I don't know what happened with Shopee France then. Do you have any insights, Jangan, or no?
I don't know what exactly happened, but I have a few pointers. So first, they entered France, I think, on the 19th of October last year.
Yeah.
And the landscape of e-commerce in France is basically a number of like traditional retailers going online, and many used second-hand marketplaces. I mean, that says a lot about people's consumption power. Um, and also Amazon. But Amazon has been facing labor issues in France. Like they had to constantly like shut and reopen their fulfillment centers because of labor issues.
But
So it's
I heard,
yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I just heard that from when I was asking my friend about Shopee in France. He was saying there is a lot of these kind of vertical commerce because it's a very mature market. But he says by and far he feels, because he believes that Amazon is still the king, right? So do you think it was hard for Shopee to displace a mature market that people don't need these kind of cheap goods model, or what do you think? From it's just too
By the
competitive.
way, I think France is also one of the best markets of AliExpress. So that's probably what Shopee was
Oh, really?
immediately
I didn't know
trying
that.
to displace. I mean, if you look at three markets, I mean, Poland, France, and Spain, they were good markets for AliExpress.
Yeah, correct.
Brazil was a good market for AliExpress. So obviously, I mean, Shopee's sourcing team in China
Yeah,
might not have as many sort of connections as Alibaba would have, but they're definitely more motivated than AliExpress people. So,
for sure.
um, so yeah, so that I think was the entry point. The question is that they have obviously tried acquisition. In the sort of way that they have been doing in other markets in France, they probably have concluded that that the market is not as attractive
Mm,
compared to other markets like Spain, like
yeah,
Poland. So I checked. I think they stopped investing in marketing in France
yeah,
in end of last year. That's when their rankings started to drop. Uh,
yeah,
but uh, but in Spain and Poland, they were still pumping in money. I mean, it's still, I mean, top of
yeah.
the chart in terms of app rankings and stuff. So yeah.
It feels very similar to Rocket Internet Playbook. We saw this when initially Rocket enters. They plow a ton of money everywhere, but you see very fast within 6 months which countries survive and which don't in terms of business models. Like I don't know if you remember, like what was Office Fab or a bunch of other ones that kind of died early days, right? So I
Hmm.
think it feels very
I
similar where
think
you test the market and your metrics don't hit the playbook, you shut down very fast.
I think it doesn't mean that they will not come back to this market later, but it means that at
Mm,
this particular point of time, I mean, let's
doesn't make
assume that
sense.
let's assume this is cyber sort of discussion. For the same amount of
Yeah,
investment they do, they can get much more traction or much more return in other
somewhere else.
markets. Yeah,
Mm,
because
okay.
they count the total orders and total GMV.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments, Dave?
I don't know. I feel like these things go. I feel like it's like a pattern to these sorts of expansion strategies, right? So like you have like these companies that do well in their home regions to grow, and then at a certain point they have all this excess capital, and then they have these growth metrics that they need to hit. So they start looking around into seeing like what are the ancillary businesses, either verticals or
Yeah.
geographies that I could expand into, and start doing like this pray and spray strategy almost, right, where they deploy on
Yeah.
a mass scale, and then eventually they'll settle into like where the return on invested capital is the
Yeah.
highest. And I think
Yeah.
what happens a lot is there's going to be a lot of like collateral damage in terms of like
I see what you mean. Yeah.
yeah, people are going to get hired, they're going to get fired really quickly.
Yeah.
um and we've seen this play out with so many companies and so many times in the past.
Yeah.
And that's why like I think I was originally a little bit bearish on their mass expansion strategy, because it just seemed like they were kind of just deploying everywhere that they think that they could have, and seeing like what
Yeah.
came back, which I think from like a corporate strategy point of view, like, because it's always a function of time and money, right? So
Yeah.
if you're doing a strategy like that, it's essentially, to me, that says I'm willing to spend a lot of money to sort of like save myself time in terms of like doing the research and being like really thoughtful and long term in my entry strategy and my expansion strategy. So I think that's just sort of where they are
True.
now.
I
So
mean, I
so
think
let me
it's
sorry let me expand.
yeah.
Sorry, one last thing. So let me expand on that. So I do think that this is probably just the beginning. I think that there will be more pullbacks from them this year in the markets where
Yeah.
they don't see the return on invested capital that they
Yeah.
would in their stronger markets. So I think we should expect more of this.
I mean, I think it's an interesting point that you bring up is that honestly, if you look at the strategies of Amazon and you look at the strategies of Shopee, like Shopee is going the top down approach where it's like, they're just go very big and then they kind of optimize. Where Amazon was kind of going bottom up, they take their time and then they kind of build it up with the value that they know about. But it converges to the same thing. You need to grow your top line as big as possible, and then you only optimize because like 1% of 1 billion is more meaningful than 1% of 1 million, right? So they're both just maximizing the top line eventually, but with very different strategies. But it's converging to the same thing. Sure. I guess the other thing is then, what do you guys like? How do you think about the Alibaba target of 100 billion GMV, which is quintupling, right? How could you meaningfully grow GMV without horizontally expanding to other countries in the same regions that they already are? Or do they have to follow another strategy? Like, because I think we all have kind of e-commerce background. So we know like SKU expansion, getting more deeper in SKUs, more categories, right? But then how do you quintuple in these, their existing markets for Alibaba? How do you think they meaningfully grow the company essentially?
I, th- I think I think a number of things, right? I mean, first you tap into the sectors that has been that is still largely offline, say groceries.
Yeah.
So that's a sector that every player in China tries to get into that. I mean, Alibaba has been buying and investing in supermarkets. So that's something which will allow them to grow the GMV to a certain extent. But again, so this comes down to execution. Right? Once the organization becomes complicated, I mean, how do you execute each part really well by yourself, and what kind of executives you hire to put into these places? I mean, look at things on the ground. Alibaba is not as competitive as Meituan in many sectors that are in direct conflict. So are they able to execute that well? And also when organization becomes complicated, when things don't get executed well, who takes the blame? So you will see that that from the leadership point of view, they probably think that first before they launch any new initiative. I mean, if this fails, who would take the blame?
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, they assigned this ex Taiwan Timor president to be heading international businesses, and that guy was demoted because he had some scandal. I mean, some extramarital affairs and stuff. So so I do think that if you put him in charge of global markets, I mean, if it works out well and it's good for the group, right? It's good and because he did the things which nobody thinks is possible, and even if he fails, it's still okay. Even this guy who's very capable, we can't really use it for the main business in China, and he still can't pull this off. Then we can basically write a conclusion that overseas markets are bad. And that's just my cynical
Dave, how do
view.
you think?
Yeah.
How do you think they can meaningfully grow GMV in a material way that's just not pushing top line in this kind of loose manner we described?
But this is the problem, right? Because as you say, pushing GMV for the sake of pushing GMV is just that, right? It is just pushing top. It's just, I mean, like we all know this, right? Like e-commerce, it's the Amazon flywheel. It comes down to three components: it's price, selection, and convenience, right? And
Execution too, but yeah.
But the execution is the implementation of these three things.
Yeah,
right,
correct. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
It's price, selection, convenience. That's what drives GMV growth and e-commerce growth. So, I mean, if we're talking about just driving GMV, I mean, shit, if I gave away like 1 million cell phones,
you get the GMV.
you can get it, but then what's the point, right? Does that?
Well, the question is retention. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a question of retention. So, and we've been through the cycle so many times. So, I think like them saying they just want to drive pure GMV growth to me strikes me as a bit odd, because I feel like we're kind of past that phase in e-commerce in Southeast Asia, right? Like if they had said something like, "Hey, we want to drive more sellers or more users, more whatever," that I think would have been to me a more let me rephrase. I think them saying we want to focus on GMV is kind of telling to me that they don't really have a clear strategy or clear thought process behind what they're doing here.
Well, so I've been thinking about this too, and I kind of agree, because like I think in almost every category, whether it's right or wrong, Shopee has more selection than Lazada. But what I'm thinking is that at this point in time, what matters most, and why I'm very biased, and what I still prefer, is that at the end of the day, the Amazon product is superior, at least for me, right, as a consumer. So I think at this point in time, if you have already gotten all the sellers, you've gotten all the categories, and you've got the price and the selection, you have to optimize on the product, which makes the stickiness factor. So anytime you're kind of pushing it, then that kind of leads to longer LTV. You get deeper then it increases your value over time, I think. So at this point in time, it makes this kind of transition, like where you've done this kind of top line strategy, you got the market share, but you have to improve the experience vastly, and just then you build from there, kind of like what Amazon has done in America, right? So that's kind of how I feel. I mean, it's very Western kind of thinking, very biased, but I do feel like that's what I'd be looking for. I'm stuck on Shopee and Lazada, but I think long term, if you keep making my experience better, I'm going to lean towards one or the other, as long as selection is somewhat similar, right? But selection at the end of the day, it's just be a price war. Like, so whoever takes less margin to kind of win, then who can survive longer, right? So that's the way I think about
I
it.
think I think if you look at Amazon flywheel selection, is basically when you have lots of customers and you can attract lots of sellers. The sellers will offer the selection, and selection will
Yeah.
attract more customers, and
Yeah,
because of
correct.
this, you
Correct.
lower the whole cost structure. So I
Correct.
don't see I don't see Alibaba and Shopee's strategy deviate away from that. I mean, maybe they just add one
Yeah,
element on top of that, they do digital finance, whatever. But at the end of the day,
yeah,
it's the same logic here: traffic,
correct.
data, and monetize.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
question is that the question is that how do you monetize in these emerging markets? I mean, do you do the same way that eventually you gravitate
Yeah.
towards brand, towards advertising, or I don't know.
I think it will have to be different, because where we are economically is not the same as where developed markets are. So I think naturally it will end up being a different flavor probably, but I mean, principles still hold.
Yeah.
I don't know. Last topic. I mean, do we have time to talk about it? I mean, we could mention SCB investing in Akulaku.
Yeah, briefly, because I think none of us would know too much about what exactly went behind the
Yeah. I don't know
negotiations.
much about this one.
Uh, yeah,
I
but
know a little bit about SCB because I recently did a podcast on EOA talking about the Thai ecosystem, and SCB is a very interesting case, which kind of alludes to other fintech possibilities in the region. So I could talk about that, but I don't know much about Akulaku though. I didn't realize you sent the deck. I didn't realize how big they were. It's like such a massive
I,
company,
I,
actually.
I I didn't send you that. I
I
never
mean,
sent
sorry,
anyone
you sent
text.
me not a news article. You sent me a news
Okay.
article about Akulaku, and yes, I learned a lot about that.
Yeah.
Jangan, I don't know. Why don't you tee off what you know about? So, what is SCB for people who don't know? What is Akulaku and what's happening?
First, SCB stands for Siam Commercial Bank, and not Standard Chartered Bank in this context. So
Yes,
so they are one of the biggest banks. I mean, one of the two biggest banks in Thailand. The other one's Kasikorn Bank or K Bank. So the two
yeah.
have been at the forefront of digital innovation in Thailand, and I would argue in the region as well. So SCB, they are particularly aggressive. So what they have done, they launched a food delivery platform called Robinhood. I think no commission, if I
Well,
remember correctly.
yeah. Also,
Yeah.
also to give more context, they are traditional banking under traditional banking license. But the end of last year, they completely reorganized and restructured to be a holding company to allow them to focus more on digital innovation. So
Yes.
under the holding, they have one banking aspect, but they're using this to invest in, other things from like crypto to food delivery to like now you could see they've led the series. Well, they were part of the Series E for Akulaku, which was massive for them, right? And I think it's very interesting because number one, the Thai ecosystem is very CVC driven, right? Corporate venture capital. It's not really this kind of flavor of led by entrepreneurs that are doing individually, but it's from what I talked to, what I understand from the players in the market is it's very corporate driven.
I have a sense that the ecosystem in Thailand is in a way very similar to that in Japan. I mean, the way that the sort of financial companies are structured,
Yeah.
the way that things are regulated. So yeah, so it is, and also in terms of in terms of the coverage of financial services, it's pretty wide. So it makes it difficult
Yeah.
for new player to come in saying that, hey, I won't disrupt the banking
Correct.
sector. And I suspect SCB and K Bank, they became especially innovative. Of course, I mean a lot of that is you have to load the leadership and the support from the top shareholders, whatever. But on the other hand, the, a lot of the things that they did happened after Ant invested in Asset Money, which is owned by CP Group. So basically, they were launching wallets, and they were trying to disrupt the digital financial scene. And I think that was a wake up call for the two banks in Thailand to start doing a
Yeah.
lot of things very aggressive. Um, and
Well,
and do you
yeah.
know that the SCB also recently acquired 51% of the largest crypto exchange in Thailand?
Yes, correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's why. But like crypto is a massive thing in Thailand, and like most people in entrepreneurship, they're either just doing crypto or they're working for SCBX or something like this, right? So it's a very different ecosystem.
Mm.
I mean, to me, the one takeaway is like we had talked about this in a previous episode is that banks probably would need to partner with tech partners. But I think SCB is kind of flipping on the head where they said that we're restructuring and we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to invest, build, and kind of execute. So the question is like, will this happen in other countries as well, where banks will try to actually do it themselves, or will they actually end up partnering with the likes of Grab and Shopee instead? So maybe I don't know if this bucks the trend. Maybe if they're
There's a,
successful, this bucks the trend. I don't know.
I think there's partnership going on, right? SCB's main competitor,
That's
KBank,
true.
they have a
Yeah.
joint venture with Line called Line BK, which does consumer finance. I think I mean, Grab's wallet in Thailand is essentially white label of KBank's solution, and
Yeah.
so basically, there's lots of partnership going on, because at the end of the day, I mean, these banks with large asset base, their cost of capital is lower, and all these large tech players want to get into digital finance. They need
Yeah.
capital, which is low cost. So I do see there's lots of room for partnership, but essentially what will happen afterwards, it depends on assessment of each individual players, right? I mean, does like Shopee or Grab want to continuously share their customer data to the banks?
Yeah.
Does the bank
I
want
think.
want
Yeah.
customers to be entry point to be continuously owned by large tech players? I think
Yeah.
this will be kind of like frenemy sort of relationship for
True.
long term.
It's a good point.
Mm.
So before, sorry, I cut you off before that. Maybe you briefly say what is Akulaku, then we could hear what Dave thinks.
Akulaku is Indonesia-based fintech companies with the core team in Shenzhen, China. So they started as remittance player in Hong Kong, helping the maids send money back home. And I think in 2015 or 2016 they went to Indonesia and they started doing buy now pay, what we now call buy now pay later. But back then um, they were trying to work with I think the e-commerce platforms, but the volume was quite small, so they launched their own e-commerce. They were selling phones,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
Wait, but also
then
the founders are all from Hong Kong or from China
Chinese.
or all
They
Hong Kong?
mainland Chinese.
I
yeah,
mean, that's what I thought. Okay. Yeah.
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 But they based it in Hong Kong to
So
start. Okay.
they were based in Shenzhen, so
Oh,
much
Shenzhen. So
more.
Shenzhen, then, oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, now you can't cross the border, but in the past you can. I think
Yeah.
they have evolved into something fairly big. They own one of the most aggressive digital banks in Indonesia called Bank Neo Commerce, and I think they
Yeah.
invested into insurance as well. So basically, they are trying to build a financial ecosystem. The difference between them and the likes of GoTo or C Group or Grab is that these guys don't have use cases. They are pure financial play. So the question is
Yeah.
that whether that kind of play would eventually work in Southeast Asia. So this is what people have been debating about.
Yeah.
So the
Dave, any
SCB,
thoughts?
the SCB,
Oh,
sorry,
sorry. Good.
just one more point. The SCB investment, I don't know exactly what's happening behind the scene. Is it that SCB wants to get into Indonesia, or is SCB want to help Akulaku go into Thailand? So, or is
I see.
just a play of Akulaku getting massive funds at very cheap cost, just like what's the other company? Atomi, the other buy now pay later player,
I
has
think it sounds like
recently.
that, honestly.
Yeah, Atomy signed up with the other SCB, right? Standard Chartered Bank,
Yeah.
$500 million
Yeah.
credit line at very low cost.
I think that sounds more likely because when I look at the company and look at some of the information I've been reading about them, the narrative, which I don't really like, is like, oh, we're a big finance company and we're attacking the $600 million, 600 million people population, which you hear that narrative all the time. Which I think now more and more you have to be a bit more specific if you're driving real value. To me, it sounds like a cash grab. It's just I don't think they have a very clear strategy. It's very all top line, like pitching top line big numbers to raise big money. That's what it sounds like to me. And they don't have a very
Like,
clear,
you mean for Akulaku?
Akulaku. Yes.
Akulaku.
I think they definitely need to be better in communications about their strategy.
Yeah.
So whatever coherence there is, and we just don't hear it.
Maybe it's just a pitch then. I don't know. But I mean, like you would think they pitched a real strategy that drives value, but it just sounds like a big pitch with big numbers. We have big user base. We're growing fast. we're attacking it, which I don't think stands in fintech specifically, given how fragmented it is. You have to think very individualistically for each country. So I would be pitching something different if I'm trying to drive value, but that's just me, I guess. I mean, they're the successful ones. I'm not.
So you did read articles I sent you?
Yeah, I read the articles you sent me. Yes.
Okay, good.
Dave, what did you get from the articles, Dave?
I actually did read some articles about this. I think it's ultimately a question of like, I mean, banking and banking in general. I think it really kind of comes down. I agree with you. It's a market by market dynamic, and what I mean by that is like, in certain markets, right? Banks make the majority of their revenue from like enterprise and commercial banking, right? And so in other markets, a large majority of that of their business comes from consumer stuff. And actually, that in markets where that's true, that's largely government led. Like the government is basically mandating this. I'll give you an example, right? So China, I think, has the banks in China are generally like fairly consumer forward, relatively speaking, for a bank. But I think that's because the CCP mandates that they, provide decent services, right? Whereas like in a place like Hong Kong, where the majority of the banks make their money based off like business business loans and business, right? The consumer banking experience is awful. Like if you've ever dealt with a Hong Kong bank, they are the biggest assholes. No matter how much money you have, they're just jerks. So I think adoption of like virtual banks is really going to be a fundamental. It's going to come down to like basically how much do the endemic banks or the traditional banks in each market value their consumer businesses, right? So I think Indonesia is somewhere in between those two extremes. So it's really a question of like, is the service they're offering better, or is there market fit, right? I don't. Other than that, I don't really have a strong opinion on this. I did note that it's interesting that they were apparently in talks with Patrick Grove to do a SPAC. There's been reports that they're looking, to do a SPAC listing
end of the year,
with
end of
Ketchup.
last year.
End of last, whatever. And I know for a fact that like Patrick has at least 2 blank check companies that he has raised, one in the US, and he's apparently raising one in Singapore as well. So
if this man pulls this off, man, I applaud him, man. This guy's like the master financial engineer, like
wizard.
He knows
he's a
his
wizard.
really well.
Wizard.
He's a wizard, man. Like I don't know how he does this over and over again.
He's a fucking wizard. But I mean, like, but that kind of like, I don't know. I have my own biases against the cashless companies, and I mostly think, being transparent, I think, Patrick's primary skills as a salesman and as a financial engineer. I think as an operator, their businesses. Yeah. So I mean, but I don't know enough about this business to really make more informed comment than that. So I'm just leave it at that.
I need to dash, but I think if for any of the listeners who are not from Thailand, who want to sort of watch what's going on in Southeast Asia in terms of fintech, SCB, Siam Commercial Bank, is definitely a player that you need to watch very closely. Some of the things they're doing.
Okay. Cool. All right, guys. Great episode, and we'll catch you next time.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Catch you later.
Bye.
Yeah. After so many times, someone disappointing you, right?
Exactly. You can't control how someone else behaves. You can only control how you react and your responses to it.
I appreciate that sentiment more these days when I understand the more nuanced context around it.
Yeah.
It's because usually the way people say it's very flippant. I think some people do use it flippantly as a weapon. They're like, "Oh, I don't need to think about how you feel. I don't care. I'm gonna just be me." So they just end up, in continuing their toxic behavior or something.
That's also their choice, right? If they want.
Correct. Yeah.
It's the same concept, really. So
the point is not to listen to it, but to see how you want to deal with it.
Exactly. I mean, that's how they choose to behave. Then whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's also harder in a workplace when you're also forced to deal with people like that, right? So the question is like, as a leader, how do you handle it? And it's very hard. It's very delicate, right? So
fire them.
if you can.
Yeah, like
Get rid of them. I mean,
yeah, like and do it as fast as possible. Usually,
yeah, no, I mean
yeah.
I know, but that's actually
That's a tough call because you also want to keep difficult people because they do like sometimes if you make it work they contribute very well vastly to things that a lot of people can't do in an organization, right? So it's a very fine line to walk.
I don't
It
know,
depends.
man. I don't know, man. There's some like pretty good arguments for not having those kinds of people on your team because it just costs way too much. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
Unless they're like the true, I don't know, like 1,000x engineer that you have on staff, it's pretty hard to justify those kinds of people.
But even you know, well, from like an engineering perspective, that's yeah, it's there's no black or white of how things get engineered, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, well, an engineer will say something different probably. But then
Yeah.
you talk to enough engineers, they will all have different opinions. So, but
I don't know. I had this like salesperson on staff once who was just like a total pain in the ass.
yeah,
And like she accounted for probably 20% of the top line on any given month. And like at the time, the justification was like, well, you know, like she's just such a high maintenance that she takes about 20% of my time. And you know, that's so I at the time I was like, it's probably fair. You know, 20% revenue, 20% my management attention. But then like I just didn't really consider like how much like pain and suffering she basically caused for the rest of the organization. Right? Like it was like 20% of my time, but then it was like it's like, you know, 5% of the ops manager's time, and then like none of the other salespeople liked her, and they all complained and whinged about her. It was like 10% of their time spent just whinging about her, and I was like, she's kind of perfect.
Yeah, no, I think when you drag down the organization, well, that's what happens. Then your culture gets poisoned, and you're in trouble, man. It's hard to turn those things around in a timely manner, right? So
Anyway,